Thank you, everybody, for joining us today at the webinar. My name is Jie Huang. I am an associate at Scott Legal PC. Today, we are going to spend some time talking about the E-2 visa requirements and answer the top questions that come up when preparing an E-2 visa application. As many of you know, Scott Legal was founded on an E-2 visa, and the founder, Ian Scott, is currently on an E-2 visa, so we know exactly what you are going through. So just a few things before we get started. Scott Legal is a full-service immigration law firm. We assist individuals pursuing various types of visas, including family-based, employment-based, but our main specialty is E-2 visas, and we regularly process a high number of them. And we will continue these webinar series, doing at least 2 webinars a month on different topics. At the end of this webinar, we will be sending out a few things. First, we will send you all a PowerPoint that has all the information that will be covered in this webinar. We will also be sending you an E-2 visa guide, which is a comprehensive guide with a wealth of information in it. We will also send you a link to where you can sign up for additional webinars in the future and also access this webinar as it will be recorded. Finally, this webinar will be available on YouTube, and we encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the notification button as we regularly upload immigration-related videos. Finally, we will send you a link where you could set up a consultation with us if that is in your interest. So today, we are very lucky to have Kelly Legrand-Wiener, who is the managing attorney at the firm with a wealth of E-2 visa experience, who will be answering these commonly found questions regarding the E-2 visa. And finally, if you have any questions at all, you can feel free to add them to the chat box or use the Q&A function, and we will try and get to all questions. So without further delay, let us move into our questions. Okay, good morning, Kelly.
Good morning.
All right, so why don't we start with the basics regarding the E-2 visa? So who can apply for an E-2 visa?
Perfect. So thank you, GA, for that introduction. So in terms of who can apply for an E-2 visa, you have to be a national of a treaty country. So treaty countries, have signed treaties with the United States for kind of reciprocal arrangements regarding these types of work visas. There are many treaty countries that would make people eligible for the E-2, including Canada, the UK, France, Spain, Mexico, Colombia, and Turkey are just a few of them. In more recent years, both New Zealand and Israel were also added to the list. And another important thing about this is it's not where you're born. So for certain things in U.S. immigration law, kind of where you're born is going to be the most relevant consideration. For the E-2 treaty visa, it's not where you're born, it's where you have a passport. So for example, we have many clients, perhaps they were born in India and maybe they've immigrated to Canada and they are now Canadian passport holders. So they are eligible for the E-2 visa based on that Canadian passport.
Oh, that is a very important distinction. Okay, so in general terms, then, what is an E-2 visa and what are the key requirements to qualify for an E-2 visa?
Yes, so the E-2 visa is a U.S. work visa that allows treaty country nationals to buy or start a business in the United States and then to come to the United States and actively run that business. There's also a category called E-2 employees, where if you're an employee who's doing either executive, supervisory, or specialized skills, you may be able to come over as an E-2 employee. But moving back to kind of the E-2 investor visa requirements, the basic requirements, if you're going to be an E-2 investor, you have to own at least 50% of the E-2 company and be coming to the U.S. to develop and direct that company. Let's say that you have a U.S. business partner, as long as it's either 50-50 or you own a majority share, so 60-40, 70-30, you can be coming over as an E-2 investor. And you also, when we say coming to develop and direct the company, sometimes we have clients that ask, can I use the E-2 visa to retire to the United States? And the answer is no. You do have to take an active role in the company if you're going to be in the U.S. on the E-2 visa. So the next big requirement is you have to make a substantial investment, to start up or buy the business. And we'll talk a little bit more later on about kind of exactly how we determine what's substantial. But key things about this requirement is, one, you have to prove a legitimate source of funds for the substantial investment. So let's say you're investing $100,000. You need to show, where did that money come from? Is it from personal savings? Perhaps you show tax returns. Is it from perhaps you own a property and you've taken out a home equity loan on that property? So whatever it is, you have to show it's from a legitimate source. The funds, your investment funds, also have to be at risk and irrevocably committed. And what that means is, if you're starting up a business, then you have to actually spend that money. So, another common question is, can I put money in a business bank account and can that be my investment? And the answer is no. The money actually has to be committed and at risk in the commercial sense. So, for a pure startup, you're going to be spending it on different things that we'll talk more about later to get the company up and running. And if it's a purchase of a business, then either you have to have transferred the money to the seller, or in a purchase situation, you can also put the money into escrow and have just one condition left, which is that the E-2 visa has to be approved. And then if it is approved, the money goes out of escrow and to the seller. And if it's denied, it comes back to the E-2 investor. So that's kind of the investment piece. Another requirement for the E-2 is the business must be real and operating. So if you're purchasing an existing business, you're going to show tax returns, you're going to show contracts or invoices, W-2s, proof there's employees. If it's a pure startup, the way that you prove real and operating is you show that you've gotten everything ready for the business to start to operate the minute you get your visa. So that means you want to have a website that's set up. You want to have your business bank account set up, any licenses that you need. If you have perhaps business partnerships you've formed in the community, letters from those business partners or letters from the Chamber of Commerce, letters of intent from clients that want to work with you once your visa is granted. So those are the types of things you would show for real and operating. Another requirement is that the business cannot be marginal. And this means that it cannot just support the investor and their family. So what this translates to is you have to hire US workers. That's it's not something that you have to, necessarily do before you've filed your petition. But you have to then have a business plan that shows that you will have, US workers, and you'll hire them over the next 5-year period. And finally, the E-2 visa is a non-immigrant visa that does not have dual intent specifically. So that means you have to show you have an intent to depart the United States. A benefit of the E-2 visa is it can be renewed indefinitely, and you do not have to show that you have a foreign residence you don't intend to abandon like you do for a B visa or an F visa. For the E-2, it's generally sufficient to just sign a statement explaining that you have an intent to depart, when the E-2 ends. And if you don't have any other red flags like immigrant petitions pending or things like that, that would generally be sufficient to meet the requirement.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much for the overview of the requirements. Now, we did have a couple of questions pop up. And I think several of them may be related. So maybe let's take a quick look. Okay, so we have one question here. The investment money funded from our joint account for mine and my wife. Does my wife have to be a 50% partner, or do we both need to apply as joint, as primary applicant? Can the secondary applicant work for the business? And I'm thinking maybe this question means, can one person be the E-2 applicant and the other person can come in as a spouse? During the interview, who do they interview, primary applicant or both?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So I think that, it's a very common situation, spouses starting a business together. Generally in that situation, we recommend that kind of one person be the primary applicant, and then the spouse just gets the spousal visa. It is possible to do 2 E-2s for both of them if you're doing a 50-50 ownership situation, but I think it's really not necessary. Usually it's going to be easier to have one person be the primary applicant. Because it's like a joint account, you can, it's generally fine. The spouse can either, if it's really from one spouse, really that's all their money, you could have that spouse, write a gift letter and that's fine. And then when you go to the interview, generally they're going to interview the primary investor with the substantive questions about the business. And the spouse will usually get a question or two about what do you plan to do in the US. E-2 spouses are now permitted to work just on the basis of being an E-2 spouse. So once you get your visa, you enter the US, you check your I-94 to make sure it says E-2S for spouse, and that authorizes you to work. So there's really, there's no issue with that. That happens very frequently. And generally you want to just kind of pick one primary person, have that person make the investment at, through the joint account. And then the other person is a spouse and can work based on their spousal visa.
Right. And I think it will help a lot of clients to know that it is fine for the funds to come from a joint account. And if the source of the funds is from the other partner can easily write a gift letter to make sure that those funds are credited in.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Let's see another related question regarding the partnership split. Okay, I'm planning to move to the US on an E-2 visa to do a business with my friend who is a US citizen, and I will have 70% ownership and my US partner will have 30% ownership. If the business value is $400K, I am investing my share, which is 70%, $280K cash. What about the US partner investment? Does he need to invest his share, which is 30%, $120K as a cash, or can he get a loan for his share on the same business? Well, that's a very particular question, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very particular. I'd say, from a general perspective, usually what we'll do in these circumstances is we try to focus just on the investment made by the E-2 investor. So even if there is kind of a US business partner, if they've already invested the money, that's fine. You can work with that. But also I think, so first of all, like whether or not your US business partner gets a loan or however they fund their portion is not relevant really, because you're really not going to be it's not part of what qualifies you as the E-2 investor. So they can get a loan if they want to, that's completely fine. The focus is going to be on that 280,000 that you're investing. What is the source of that? From a loan perspective, it cannot be secured by the assets of the E-2 business. And generally what, in those circumstances, what we kind of show is that, you spend 100% of the cost for your 70% share. So the focus would be on your 280,000. It would kind of depend. If it was a startup, it's a little bit easier to make that argument. If you're purchasing a business and the sale price is 400,000, it's a little bit more complicated. And that's something we would discuss in the context of a consult. But as a general matter, the focus is going to be on the E-2 investors' $280,000 investment.
Great. Very, very helpful. All right, now let us move to the questions again. So, okay, so once you get an E-2 visa, how long does an E-2 visa last for? And I think you sort of touched on it.
Yes. So then an E-2 visa, basically the length that it will be granted for is going to depend on the country where you're a citizen. So for example, there are some countries like Canada where they can get the E-2 visa stamp for 5 years. And then every time you enter the US, you get 2 years in E-2 status. So during that 5-year period, you would have to kind of leave and re-enter the US, anytime you were getting close to that 2-year period. There are also some countries where the reciprocity period for the visa is very short. So some countries like Egypt and Bangladesh, where they can only get a visa stamp for 3 months. However, when they use that stamp to enter the US, they too can get 2 years on E-2 status. So some people who don't need to travel a lot might get that stamp for 3 months, enter, stay for the full 2 years to develop the business, and then go back to renew. Some people need to travel more frequently. They would be in a position of needing to go back to the consulate once they left the United States to get a new visa. But I'd say, 3 months is less common. More commonly, you see a few years at least for each country.
Yeah, that is great. And I do think we have a related question in the Q&A box here, right? So this person is a Canadian citizen and they live in Canada. And if he or she buys a business in the US and I presume get an E-2 visa, can I live in Canada and commute every day into the USA for business? Doesn't mean each time I enter into the USA, I need to go to the immigration office and get stamped and get a 2-year permit.
So the way that this would work is if you were getting an E-2 visa, you would go to the consulate, you would get an E-2 visa in your passport. And then every time you entered the US, when you crossed to commute, you would show your E-2 visa to the officer. You would not necessarily need to pay, like, when you're crossing by a land border, sometimes they still want you to kind of pay for a new I-94. You wouldn't need to do that. You would just want to kind of keep track of your I-94 so that once you were getting close to the 2-year mark, that's when you would say to them, hey, this time, can I, pay for a new I-94 or, stamp me for the 2 more years. So you wouldn't need to kind of go into the immigration office necessarily, but if you are commuting every day, you will need to pass through Customs and Border Patrol inspection every day and show your visa. And, ostensibly, yes, they could stamp you for 2 years each time. Usually what they do is, if you're going through the land border, they're not going to stamp you every single time, but they'll review your visa to make sure that they're entering you into the E-2 status. And then, once you getting close to that 2 years, you can ask for them to, make sure that the I-94 is updated for another 2 years.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So this person could get the initial I-94 and get the 2-year and verify that the 2 years is there, and then go and commute. And then once the time is reaching to completion, they can pay to get a new I-94.
Right. I think,
Yeah, that makes a lot of
right.
sense.
Especially if you're going through land. If you're flying, then you don't need to pay. They'll just give you a new I-94 every single time. The key for this person really is just travel with your passport with your E-2 visa stamp in it and make sure they've entered you in E-2 status, because sometimes they wave Canadians through and put them automatically into B status. And if you're accidentally entered into B status, you shouldn't be doing E-2 activities until you've gotten that corrected.
Right. Very important distinctions there. All right. So let us move to the next question. And this undoubtedly is something that comes up a lot. And the question is, how much investment is needed for an E-2 visa?
Yes, this is a very common question. So I think there is no minimum set amount, for an E-2 visa. There's nothing in the regulations that says it has to be this, it has to be that. That being said, some amounts are just too small, right? So $5,000 investment is never going to get you an E-2 visa. It is just too small. What you want to do and what the government looks at is they use a proportionality test. So they're going to look at how much did you invest versus the total cost to either start up or buy the business. And for smaller investments, you want to be able to say that you've invested 100% of that cost, right? So let's say if you're purchasing a business on the open market, and it's, selling for $75,000 and you purchased that because that was on the open market, you didn't kind of know the seller at all. There is a very strong argument that that is a substantial amount. That's 100% of the cost to purchase this business. If you're starting up a business, then you have a little bit more room to make arguments. Like you could say, okay, like look at the, I'm starting up a marketing consultancy. Here's some industry reports. Here's some market research reports that show you can start up this type of business for only, $20,000 or $25,000. And here I've spent, $55,000. Therefore, I've spent well over 100% of the cost to set up this business. So you want to just always kind of look at that, like what is the total cost to start up the business versus how much have I actually spent? And you want to consider what are the normal startup costs for that type of business. Service-based businesses, necessarily will have lower startup costs, versus someone like a manufacturer, where you need a lot of equipment, you need a lot of space, you need a lot of employees, maybe you need some inventory, all of that is going to have higher startup costs. For very, very large investments, you can kind of get away with less invested. So let's say you're doing real estate, commercial real estate development, and the total cost of your project's $100 million and you've invested 10 million. That is likely going to be sufficient. That's likely going to be fine because the magnitude of the investment is so large. But I would say the vast majority of people are investing much, most of these people are investing under $1 million. Most, in fact, even are investing under 500,000, under 300,000 maybe. And for those types of smaller investments, you really want to be able to argue that you've invested 100% of the cost to get that business, up and running.
Right. So the important consideration here is how much does it usually cost for that type of business to get up and running?
Exactly.
Right. All right, now let's move on to another very common question, which is what are some strategies to deal with a weaker case? And if you could also explain a little bit what makes a case weak or strong relatively from what you've seen.
Sure. So, I think, a weaker case, is going to be a case that doesn't have, um, like it has a smaller investment amount. Perhaps employees haven't been hired, like doesn't have kind of client contracts in place or kind of letters of intent or any indications from the local business community that there, are, kind of is support in place for that business. So I think that, a stronger case, in contrast is a case where either, the investment amount is higher, or even if it's a lower investment amount, that's supported by market industry reports, market research that shows, this is the total cost to set up this business. If the business was able to hire an employee or has active job listings, if the business is able to show kind of any interest from the market, the clients that want to hire their company once they get their visa, letters of intent, expressions of interest from anyone in the community. Those are all things you can do to strengthen your case.
I see. Now, why don't we then shift gears a little bit and talk about the nitty-gritty details of expenditures that an investor would make to set up a business. So what are some common E-2 visa expenditures, and are all expenditures good for the purpose of the application?
Right. So, so no, not all expenditures are good. Unfortunately, good expenditures are kind of any expenditures that you need to directly get the business up and running. So, for example, a commercial office space, fees you pay to incorporate your business. If you need to buy a computer, if you need to buy software, if there's any office equipment that you need to have, if there's any licenses you need for your business to legally run in your state or community. Legal fees can be included, payroll. So if you have employees you want to hire, you need to hire a payroll company. Anything you pay to market your company, if it's a company that needs inventory, or it's a company that needs kind of a warehouse or factory space, any money you pay for that. Those are all really strong E-2 expenses. You want to think about just, logically, when you think about a particular type of business, what does this business need to run, right? So like, let's say you're starting up a wedding photography business, very logically, you'd expect to see photography equipment, as part of that startup expense schedule. You'd also expect to see, money spent on a website so you can market. So you want to think about like spending on kind of a diversity of expenditures so that you can really argue that everything to get this business up and running has been spent. On the other side, kind of expenses that are not so good, travel. So, sometimes people will try to include flights. And even though it's true that you may need to fly to the United States to kind of get things, situated for your business, they're just not considered strong expenses. And then anything that goes along with travel, so hotel, food, entertainment, things like that, generally frowned upon. In fact, there are some consulates that even have specifically on their website do not include lists of flights or lists of food or taxis. They don't want to see it. And so even when people kind of have those expenditures, we generally will not include them, because it's not only that they'll discount them, but it actually will it makes the case generally weaker, in our opinion.
Right. So I think what I'm getting is that the expenditures being related and actually necessary for starting up the business is really the key thing. And for travel expenses and things like that, there is an argument that is not related as much.
Right, that it's not related, and that they just don't consider it to be directly part of the startup expenditures, for the company. So it's just something that's, just not considered to be a very strong expense. Yeah.
Right. And another important point that I get is that there needs to be a variety of expenditures. It can't just be from one particular category, but the consulates would expect to see money spent on a variety of things.
Right. Because I think that almost goes along with real and operating, right? You need to
Right.
show you've spent everything that's necessary to get the business up and running to the point where it could be operational. So if you've made one large expenditure for office space, but you have nothing else set up,
Right.
I think it can be a bit harder to argue you've actually spent 100% of the cost to get the business up and running. So that's why I think is important to expend on different things. Another point to make, I think that another kind of category of potentially weak expenditures are expenditures that are made between related companies. So let's say that let's say that you're from Australia and you have a company in Australia where you do website design, and now you're starting a website design company in the United States, and your Australian company designed your website, and you paid money to your Australian company and you own both companies 100%. So, when we talk about your investment being at risk and committed, I think that it's not that you 100% have to discount that expenditure. You could potentially keep it in, but you have to know that it's a weaker expenditure. And if an officer was to look at it, they might feel misled, right? They might feel that, okay, you just took your own money from your US company and transferred it to your Australian company, and you own both 100%. I think when there's an actual kind of product that you're transferring, like an asset, like let's say you paid for all of your computers and those were shipped to the US, I think it's a bit easier to include that. But when it's a service, it's a bit harder.
Right. And is it usually more favorable to have these expenditures take place in the US as opposed to your home country?
So there is no requirement that the money has to be spent in the US, but we have in the past had some officers who do ask our clients, how much did you spend in the US? And the E-2 visa, is supposed to facilitate economic trade between two different countries. So we do think there is a benefit to having at least some of your expenditures be in the United States, if at all possible.
Right. Very helpful. Okay, now why don't we shift gears a little bit now and talk about some types of business? And so consulting business is a very common category that we see. And so what would be some common challenges and tips for consulting business in particular?
Sure. So I think, clients starting consulting businesses will often come to us, and one of their biggest challenges is they don't feel they can invest a substantial amount because they say, I have, my expertise. I already own a computer. I don't need office space. I'm going to be working from home. I have nothing to spend money on. So I think that's kind of an initial challenge, that clients have to think about, okay, how can I get to the point where I've spent, up to 35, 40, 45, $50,000, maybe put some remainder in the business bank account as working capital. And, we have kind of various things that we'll advise they spend money on. A lot of them I just kind of mentioned. I think that office space, even though it's something that is less and less needed, particularly in light of COVID, I think it does help, having that commercial office space, having even if it's just a, virtual desk, or a hot desk at a WeWork or a Regis, I think it does help give that impression, that you have an actual business address. It's not just a home. You could also think about things you could spend money on that perhaps you would have waited, but perhaps you weren't going to do a website upgrade, but maybe you spend a little bit more money on it up front. Perhaps you would have waited and hired an employee, an office manager, a year in, but instead you hire them early on. So you can also have those expenditures related to payroll and things like that. So we encourage people to spend money on things that are going to be useful for them down the line. And not to just throw money away, but to think, okay, what are some expenditures that I can actually maybe either pay up front or kind of purchase now because this is what I need for the investment. On the side of kind of the actually getting the visa, I think that consulting businesses have the challenge of officers being concerned that they're going to come in and operate as a solo consultant, because the E-2 visa really is for people that are going to develop and direct a business that's going to support more than just themselves. That's part of the requirements. You have to hire US workers. You have to have employees. And, so I think that's something that consultants often will face is, well, maybe you were a consultant for several years, maybe you even ran your own consulting company. And particularly if you did that and you didn't have any employees, you're kind of operating, trying to convince the officer, no, I'm actually going to expand this. I'm actually going to hire other people. So I think that hiring an employee before filing for consulting businesses can be really, really helpful. Another thing about consultants is sometimes they're concerned that there's so many consultants, it's a saturated market, and how are you actually going to get clients? So it's really important for consultants to have either client contracts, letters of intent, memorandums of understanding, anything that shows that you actually do have people that are interested in your services can be really, really helpful for these types of cases.
Oh, that is a very useful tip, especially regarding the letters of intent. And with regards to hiring plans for employees in the future, right? And for that, I think the business plan will play a very important role.
That's correct. Yes. So I think that, if you are able to hire an employee before you file, that can be really helpful, but many, many people cannot, for many, very viable reasons. And, I think in that case, the business plan is really key. It's really key for any startup, investor case, and it should outline a 5-year hiring plan. We generally recommend trying to hire at least one part-time employee, in the first couple of years. And then by year 5, when you're hopefully going for your renewal, having at least 3 to 4 full-time W-2 employees is, would be really important, I think, for a strong renewal case.
All right. Very helpful. All right. And so let's continue on discussing about some these particular E-2 categories. What about real estate projects? That is also another category that we get a lot of questions on. Do real estate projects make good E-2 visa cases?
So I'd say generally they're very risky. Having a real estate based, E-2 is it's a risky industry. There's a really common misconception that you can just purchase a property, put it into a limited liability company name, and use that as an investment. And that's something else that consulates actually have on their own website often is they will say you cannot do this because many people try to do it. So for E-2 companies, a key thing is that you want to be able to demonstrate that your business is actually real and operating, that it's not just a passive real estate investment. So similar, like just owning a couple properties and saying, I put them on Airbnb, that's generally just not going to rise to the level of being active enough to be considered real and operating for the E-2 visa. So some real estate ideas that have worked that we have done with other clients. So for example, a real estate brokerage firm, a real estate property management company. Let's say you're doing renovation and construction, also house flipping, but only if you're doing that on either as part of another business. So let's say you're doing renovation and construction, and then you also have a side house flipping business that might work. Or let's say you're doing house flipping on a very large scale. So for example, you own 30 or 40 properties and you're doing flipping and you're also doing, the other work involved in that. So I think that's, a few different ways that you can make real estate work. So it's definitely possible, but you want to really, talk about it with your attorney and figure out, how are you going to show that the business is going to be active and is going to hire employees. You also want to make sure you have the appropriate licenses. Like, let's say if you're doing, if you're a realtor, or you're doing something like that, or you're doing construction, states have, very significant licensing requirements. So often you'll need to make a plan for that. Are you able to get your license ahead of time? Some places require a social security number. So sometimes maybe you need a U.S. business partner to assist, or perhaps you need to have a temporary partnership with a local person who is licensed while you get your license. But either way, you need to also plan for that. The government isn't always up to date on what all the local licensing requirements are, but they do know it's a regulated industry. And so they're likely to ask about it.
Right. And I imagine that it'll be important for the real and operating prong to show that you have a license, or at least there is a system in place so that the business can be up and running.
Exactly.
Right. And so, yeah, to wrap this up, are there any other risky E-2 business types that we should be mindful of?
There are. So I think another one that comes up a lot is kind of equity trading. So this is almost has some similarities to the real estate in the sense that people will kind of take their stock portfolio and kind of want to put it into a corporate entity. And similar to the real estate industry, The challenge is to show this is going to be active. This is going to be an active business. I'm not just trading, passively for myself or for some friends and family. You need to be able to show that the business is going to grow enough to hire employees, to have clients that are outside of your family. And also it's a very regulated industry. So again, you need to make sure that you have the proper, licensing to do this type of business.
All right. That is very helpful. Thank you, Kelly. So now let's shift gears again and talk about why are some E-2 visas denied? What are some of the common reasons that we see denials?
Sure. So I think, one is low investment amount. So we've talked, a bit about kind of how do you show that your investment is high enough. I think, there are some consulates that are just more friendly to lower investment amounts and some that are less friendly, particularly if you're, kind of at a consulate that sees a lot of large companies that are coming over as E-2 companies. They may see a $70,000, $80,000 investment, and it's just not going to be acceptable. So it is important to kind of talk to your attorney about where are you applying? What are your options? Do you have any other places you could possibly go? Because consular officers change over the years. So over the years, different consulates will kind of come up with, perhaps different approaches to this, but there are some places that are generally friendly to lower investment amounts. Canada is one of them. USCIS, if you file for a change of status within the United States, is also very friendly to kind of lower investment amounts. Another reason some are denied is, kind of the nature of the business. So the businesses we just talked about, are you in a risky area? Do you have a consulting business and no contracts or employees? Are you in real estate and you just have a couple properties you purchased? So the actual nature of the enterprise can make, and more likely to be denied. Another is kind of your filing location or your venue. So as I just mentioned, there's some consulates that are more E-2 friendly and some consulates that are more E-2 friendly to low investment amounts, and some that are kind of less E-2 friendly generally. Maybe they don't process them a lot, or maybe they do, but they take a really particular view on how they should be processed. So that's something to keep in mind. Another thing that can happen is just a concern over whether the business is going to create jobs for U.S. workers. So let's say like you've been running a business in your home country for years and you never hired anyone, and now you're starting up that same business in the U.S. That officer may have some real concerns that you're actually going to hire employees. In that type of circumstance, that would be a case where it's really helpful for you to hire somebody before you apply. You may have issues with the adjudicating officer. Unfortunately, consular officers have complete discretion over whether to grant or deny the E-2 visa. So, if you do get an officer that's either having a bad day, doesn't seem to understand the requirements, the best you can do is to be as polite as possible and try to get as much detail as possible from them about what they're unhappy with, because a denial doesn't prevent you from reapplying, from trying to address whatever it was that they seemed unhappy about and reapplying. And if they seem to have an, incorrect understanding of the law, you could always kind of address that on, when you're resubmitting. Unfortunately, though, they do have that discretion, so you don't have any kind of ability to appeal their decision, even if you think it's incorrect. And the last thing that comes up, I think, for denials is if you just didn't meet the requirements at the time of filing. And we see this sometimes when people, perhaps file on their own, perhaps file with attorneys that aren't as familiar with the E-2. So for example, we had a client that came to us and they'd spent, $2,000 and there was $98,000 in a business bank account. It just doesn't meet the requirements of a substantial investment that's at risk and irrevocably committed. However, they worked with us. We were able to advise them on what to spend money on. They were able to go back and get approved. So it is important to kind of either on your own or with an attorney, make sure you're really understanding those requirements. So your initial petition is addressing each of those.
Very, very helpful and important points. Now, maybe this is a good time for us to go to the Q&A box, because we do have some questions regarding the technicalities of applying for the E-2 visa. Okay, so maybe let's start with this question here. Okay, somebody wants to move to the USA from the UK, but they want to check out the business first so I can apply for the E-2. What visa should I go with? Also, if I have my son needed to start school, how is that managed with the application timescale? And for those types of very specific questions, I really encourage people to set up a consultations, because it is very hard to get a full picture of your situations just with this format, but we will get to the general legal questions that are involved. Can you apply for an E-2 if your relative has put a green card petition in place already 6 years ago? Does this affect the E-2 visa?
Perfect. So a few different things, kind of going on here. Can you go check out a business? Yes, many people do it. Often, if they're from the UK, they'll come on ESTA if they're eligible for ESTA. If not, you can also apply for a B1 business visitor visa. It's explicitly permitted to use that visa to come and check out E2 investments. In terms of kind of the issues of having a child in school and trying to figure that out, ultimately, it's something that the client kind of has to work out with their, internally in their family and with their visa application. So, we have some clients that will kind of try to time it so that they're coming, during the winter break, and their child can start school later. Sometimes you have it so that the investor will go first and perhaps the spouse and children will apply for their visas at a later time and come later. I think that was another question we may have had. You don't have to all apply at the same time. The E-2 investor can get their visa first, and then the spouse and children can get their visas at a later time. So you don't all have to do it together. In terms of, like the actual timing in the UK right now, it takes about 45 business days for them to review the petitions, and then consular appointments are available a few weeks later. That is constantly changing. So whenever you kind of sign up for your visa, you want to kind of discuss with the attorney to see what are the current timeframes. And then the final piece of this question, can you apply if somebody's put a green card petition in place for you? It depends. We do have many clients, like let's say they have an I-130 family petition filed and the priority date's really, really backdated. Yes, like they're able to get an E-2 visa and it's not an issue. And, you do have to declare it on your DS-160. You have to explain you have a green card petition pending, but you would just explain, this was filed, like I still don't know what I'm doing at this point. I just have temporary intent while I'm coming to run the E-2, and the focus is on what is your intent at that particular entry. So if you were in a case where, you had a green card petition filed and your priority date was about to be current, you might receive a little more pushback. You might get some more questions. But if it's very long dated, usually it's not an issue.
Very helpful. And did we answer this little question on how long is E-2 processing time for an applicant from Canada?
So for Canada right now, it's like once you submit your petition, it takes about 10 business days, and then they'll contact you to allow you to go onto the website and schedule your appointment. Right now, we have clients who are being contacted and then scheduling appointments for kind of February and March. A couple of months ago, the earliest available was kind of June or July. So it's kind of bouncing all over the place. But most of our clients, even if they scheduled, let's say they scheduled, in August for a June 2023 date, many of them were able to get appointments much earlier, even this year, by just logging onto the system, and consistently, because people are always kind of canceling or rescheduling. So that's Canada right now.
Great. I'm sure that was helpful. Okay, so why don't we go back to some of the remaining questions, general questions. Okay, so employees. Do you have to have employees before filing for an E-2 visa?
You don't. You don't have to have employees. It's helpful if you do, but many of our clients do not. There are anecdotally kind of some consulates that take a different position that is not supported in the law. So it is something you can kind of try to push back on, but it's also something where you may just decide, okay, let's kind of like hire an employee ahead of time. Many times people are able to get either an office manager or a part-time worker who can do some of those setup activities for them, maybe do some initial contact with clients. So no, it's not required. I'd say even the majority of our clients don't hire employees before they file, but it is very beneficial if you can get them.
Right, and it could be a good way to strengthen an otherwise weaker petition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. Another question we have, can I obtain a loan or a gift for my investment funds?
So yes, you can. Your investment can, as I mentioned earlier, it has to be from a legitimate source, and it also cannot be secured by the assets of the E-2 business. So for example, if you're doing a purchase situation and there's kind of like seller financing, that generally is not going to work, because usually the security in that case is the actual assets of the company. But if you're going to get an unsecured loan, a personal loan, a loan based on some collateral that you own, that's all completely fine. And a gift is also fine. For a loan, or if it's a personal loan from an individual, or if it's a gift from an individual, you do still need to show the source of that money. So if you have like a gift from your mother, for example, your mother would write a gift letter, and then you would also need, if it was from personal savings from employment, the mother's tax returns, or if it was from, perhaps your mother sold a house, the purchase sale agreement of the house, and proof of your mother receiving that money. So getting a gift, it doesn't mean that you can ignore that you still need to know kind of the source of that money.
Yeah, very important point right there. Okay, so we can now move on to talking about after somebody gets the business, the E-2 visa. Can somebody change their business after they get the E-2 visa, come to the US and establish that business?
So you can potentially, but it depends on if it's considered a substantive or non-substantive change. So let's say, for example, you're a wedding photographer, you want to start a blog that, kind of markets your photographs and also kind of adds some information about, wedding products. So that's pretty aligned. That's pretty much kind of like a natural outgrowth of kind of, you're still doing wedding photography. That's your primary activity. And now you're adding something that's very related to that. So for that, that's probably a change that's completely fine. You probably don't need to report that anywhere, and you could just continue on with your business. Now, let's say you're a wedding photographer and now that business has failed, or, you don't want to do it anymore. And now you want to start a restaurant. So this would be a substantive change. It's clearly extremely different from everything you presented at the consulate. And even if you have a valid visa, before you would start running your restaurant, you would have to go back to either the consulate where you were initially approved or to USCIS and get an approval first. And in all likelihood, you would need to submit new documents showing your ownership, showing you meet each of the E-2 requirements, showing you've made a substantial investment. One thing that you can't do is you cannot kind of come to come on one, visa. Let's say you're doing a marketing consultancy and then decide you're going to do something completely different and then just shift to that without any discussion with the government or any approvals from the government. I think that, there are some people, unfortunately, where that might happen, where something goes wrong with the one business and they don't try to get an approval before they just shift to another business entirely. So you want to make sure that you're having a discussion with your attorney before you make any changes or additions to your services, to make sure that you don't need to go back to the government and get an additional approval first.
Very, very important points. I think we have a couple of questions in the Q&A box regarding change of status after somebody is in the US. So maybe we can answer those. So what would be the change of status options if you are in the USA from the UK? And that would be same for any nationality who is
potentially, but the UK has a wrinkle, because for the UK, it's the one nationality where you also have to be a resident of the UK in order to qualify. So like, many people, maybe they were born somewhere else entirely, but they also have a UK passport, but they've never lived in the UK. Those people cannot qualify for an E-2 visa. So if you're in the US, from the UK, and you previously can show that you were a resident of the UK. So like, let's say you moved here, on a work visa, and you've been here for a couple of years, but prior to that, you were living in the UK. Then probably, yes, you're still eligible for an E-2 visa. But if you had never lived in the UK, you're not. So going back to the general question, which is, what are your change of status options if you're in the US? If you're in the US on a visa that allows you to change status, then you can change to E-2 status. So let's say you entered on a B1 or a B2 visa, and now you're here. Yes, it is possible to change your status. You would file something called Form I-129 with USCIS. There are some downsides to changing status as opposed to getting a visa. It doesn't permit you to travel. So even if you get an E-2 approval, it'll only be for 2 years. And once you left the US, you could not actually re-enter until you went to a consulate and got a visa. And the E-2 is different than other visas like the H or the L. Like, let's say for the H, you get an approval from USCIS. you just go to the consulate and they're kind of supposed to rubber stamp your, your passport. They might look at a few things, but generally they're supposed to rely on the approval. The E-2 is not like that. So the consulate is not going to be relying on the approval from USCIS. They might consider it. They might even consider it favorably, but they do not have to rely on it at all. Another potential thing to mention is, let's say that you came from the UK on ESTA. You cannot change status when you're on ESTA. So if you came on ESTA and you're here on ESTA, it's not possible to change to E-2 status in the US. You would have to enter on an actual B1 or B2 visa.
Yeah, very, very important distinctions there. So another related question, I think it is regarding, and by primary and secondary applicant, I'm assuming they mean the primary applicant and the spouse. So once somebody gets an E-2 status, can they switch, right? Can the primary applicant become the spouse and the spouse applicant become the primary applicant in some way? I think that's what the question is asking.
I mean, I think that like you would have to go back and do a brand new application. So if you wanted to switch, it would involve doing a new E-2 investor application for the, so there's no easy way to switch
Right.
without, you would have to do a brand new application and probably make a new investment.
Right. And so for this last question on the Q&A box, I believe this is also a very specific fact related question. So in those kinds of issues, I think the best thing that we will recommend is to set up a consultation with us. We'll be sending you a link to that. You can sign up for a 30-minute consultation or a 1-hour consultation, and we will be able to look at the situation in a very detailed manner. So that is what I would propose you to do. Okay, so I think that is it. I think one more question that we commonly get is can somebody buy a business from a relative? So regarding relative transactions.
Sure. So yes, you can buy a business from a relative. We do have many people that have done it. The thing to keep in mind is that you're likely to encounter more scrutiny. So it's not the same as just you found a business online. And this is actually the fair market value of the business. You're going to have to probably do a little more to show the officer that this really is the fair market value for this business. So you could get a third party valuation. You could get a CPA to write a letter, and also just the purchase price should make sense in light of the business's financials. So they'll want to see the tax returns. They'll want to see the profit and loss and balance sheet, and the amount that you're paying for the business, should make sense in light of kind of what it looks like the business is worth. And it's always helpful to get that third party objective letter that kind of reinforces that.
Okay, so that is all of the questions that I had for you today, and I don't believe we have any more questions coming in. Maybe give 1 more minute. Yeah. So this is great. Oh, okay. Thank you. Okay, that's great. So yeah, I hope this session was helpful for everybody, and we are very happy to help you with your E-2 journey. Please feel free to check out our other resources that we'll be sending you, and feel free to reach out to us for a consultation. Thank you, everybody, for your time. Thank you, Kelly, and I hope everybody has a good day.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day.